The USS Enterprise NCC-1701 is one of the most iconic starships in sci-fi. In fact, it technically is 12 of the most iconic starships in sci-fi, as it has gone through many revisions over the course of the show. A couple years ago, I made several 3D models of the various versions of the USS Enterprise, and while making them, I ended up gathering some information about them. And I love this sort of thing, so it snowballed into me researching all the different versions of the Enterprise, and now I have all this information that's not particularly useful in most conversations. So I decided to make a YouTube video about it. This is going to be part 1 of 2. In this video, I'm going to discuss the production of the various versions of the Enterprise from a real-world perspective. Basically, discussing the designs and production of the versions of the Enterprise and how it evolved from a film production standpoint. Part 2 will discuss the in-universe evolution and how the Enterprise was upgraded and changed within the story of Star Trek itself. This video will be going in order of appearance, so the best place to start would be the original series and the starship that started it all. The most important element of this first version was just figuring out how to design the Enterprise. The creator of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry, had several ideas of what the ship could be, but didn't have a specific image in mind, so the task of creating the visual identity of the Enterprise was up to Matt Jeffries, who was armed with a series of notes from Gene. One of these notes was that the ship had to be powerful and fast, which took Matt down a line of thinking to put the engines away from the rest of the ship. Matt also wanted to stay clear of the saucer shape to avoid comparisons with the flying saucer archetype popular in sci-fi, but eventually decided that it just looked better. Jeffries also fought hard to keep the exterior of the ship smooth, as space was a dangerous place, so nobody would be putting anything on the exterior of the ship. There was also a story where Gene and the executive producers came in and saw the concept art that Jeffries had created, which depicted the nearly final version of the Enterprise. And when they liked that, Jeffries showed them the small wooden model he had created. Gene took the model by the attached string, and due to the top-heavy nature of the model, it flipped upside down. Jeffries had an awful time trying to unsell that and have the producers use the correct version. And finally, they had to create the registry number. They wanted the number to be easily identifiable, so the numbers 3, 6, 8, and 9 were all eliminated from consideration. The number they came up with was 1701, which was described as being due to the Enterprise being the first ship of Starfleet's 17th starship design. NCC was born by combining the U.S. aircraft registration code NC and the Soviets using C for their aircraft as a symbolic way to show all of Earth being united. It's important to consider that this would have happened at around the time of the Cold War. Now, it was time to start filming the pilot episode, The Cage. Eagle-eyed viewers may notice that this still doesn't really resemble the Enterprise we see during the series. The first model, coming in at just under 3 feet long, was the one used for the pilot episode, as the larger 11-foot model was not yet constructed. The models saw some small changes before filming of the series properly began, most notably removing the spikes on the front domes and reducing the size of the dish on the front of the lower hull. This would then become the Enterprise we know today. One thing to note is that Star Trek had a very limited budget, which did not allow for anything too fancy, preventing the production team from making much more than simple shots of the Enterprise. The 11-foot model was so large that it was extremely difficult to get the fast shots that Gene wanted, nor was it easy to get the shots at all. It was mounted in place in front of a blue screen, and the camera would move around the model. Using cinematic trickery, this would simulate the Enterprise moving past the camera. By the third season of the show, most shots of the Enterprise were just footage shot for the earlier seasons. There were a couple times that this Enterprise was seen after this point, and it was kept as accurate as possible, including a full model created for a DS9 episode that revisits an episode from the original series. As of now, the 11-foot model is on display at the Smithsonian Museum. After the third season, the show was cancelled. Gene Roddenberry did get an animated show to run for a bit, which used an animated version of what we saw in the first show. In fact, a lot of the shots were rotoscoped, which helped speed up the animation process. After the animated show ended, Gene started work on a movie, Star Trek Planet of the Titans. He even got Ralph McQuarrie to do some concept art for a new version of the Enterprise. However, this got cancelled as a different TV show was considered, with yet another version of the Enterprise planned. Jeffries designed a new version of the Enterprise, starting from the original and changing some elements that he felt would have been upgraded, such as the engines, and moved some other things around, such as the dish. This TV show then got cancelled for yet another movie, and this one actually ended up happening. Jeffries left the project, so Richard Taylor stepped in to remake the Enterprise. He wanted to start from scratch, but Gene told him to start from where Jeffries left off. The movie allowed for extra details to be visible, so various details such as phaser banks and thrusters were added to the hull. Eventually, basically the entire ship was redesigned in one way or another. An important upgrade made from the original was the ability to film this model from virtually any angle, where the original was extremely limited in that regard. An interlocking paneling effect was added to give more detail, using a paint that had the unfortunate side effect of reflecting light back in strange ways, which made filming much more difficult. Extra lights were also added for the reason of there being extremely limited lighting in space. And also to make the Enterprise look better. ILM, the production house for the movies, found this model extremely difficult to work with since it required several people and a forklift just to move. To be fair, it was 8 feet long and made of metal and wood. It also took very careful filming to make sure it moved gracefully on the screen and not awkwardly and stilted. When the next film, Wrath of Khan, came around, the model would be painted a matte gray to help avoid the lighting issues, and ILM would have to develop methods to damage the ship without actually damaging the model itself. Then, the next film came along, The Search for Spock. The plot was deemed to be too predictable, so the decision was made to make the Enterprise explode. VFX supervisor Ken Ralston took special pleasure in this as he did not like the model. Much to his chagrin, instead of just replacing the Enterprise with a new model, it was replaced with the exact same model, just with an A at the end of the registry number. At roughly the same time that this happened, something else was announced. Star Trek was coming back to the TV, this time for a new generation. Sorry, that's a bad joke, but I had to put it in the video. Star Trek The Next Generation was announced, and this meant there was to be a new USS Enterprise. This was to be designed by Andrew Probert, who had helped refine the design of the motion picture Enterprise. The overall design remained true to the original Matt Jeffries design, keeping the 3 sections where they were. However, they were updated considerably as this new show took place 78 years after the original show, and as such, technology would have advanced. For one thing, this Enterprise is much larger, as well as a bit squashed in some places. The ship also runs smoothly between the various sections, as opposed to the rather sharp angles of the previous Enterprise. There were two models created initially, one coming in at 2 feet long and the other coming in at 6 feet, that could also separate into two pieces. ILM then filmed a few test scenes, including the jump to warp scene in the opening credits. Other shots were created as needed per episode. The production team came to dislike using this 6-foot model as it was extremely cumbersome and it lacked surface details, which made close-up shots pretty rough to use. So a 3-foot model was constructed with extra surface detail for use. When it came time to film for Star Trek Generations, the 6-foot model was enhanced for the saucer separation sequence, and a massive 12-foot saucer was created to crash onto the planet. Before we move forward, we have to take a half step back. The Next Generation Season 3 Episode 15 shows us the USS Enterprise C. The Enterprise D has a display case of the previous versions of the Enterprise, so a basic design was already in place for the ship, but an actual model was needed very suddenly, and there wasn't enough time to fully create the ship that was envisioned. So various corners were cut. What we ended up getting is nothing short of an absolute miracle. The Enterprise C was designed to bridge the gap between what we saw in the movies and the Enterprise D. The saucer and engineering hull were reminiscent of the movies, while the nacelles and pylons were closer to the Enterprise D. The model itself wasn't great quality, which was alright, as it was going to be damaged and seen only in wide shots on TVs made in the 1980s. Unfortunately, as this Enterprise only showed up in one episode, there isn't much to talk about. So, now we can move on. Right back to Generations. The opening scene of Star Trek Generations features the USS Enterprise B. The Enterprise B was created using the model for the USS Excelsior, used in previous movies, with extra parts glued onto it in an attempt to preserve the original Excelsior model. This did not work, and removing the additions would have destroyed the model. A CGI model was also created for some scenes with lighting that would have been too difficult to film practically. Ultimately, the Enterprise B was not seen for very long, since after the opening scene, it is never seen again. Personally, I don't mind that. However, that does bring us to the USS Enterprise E. After Generations, the model of the Enterprise D was labeled as the Enterprise E, though that ended up not really going anywhere. What happened instead is that a 10-foot model of a new ship was created for Star Trek First Contact to be used alongside a CGI model. However, the model was only ever in that movie, and the CGI model was used exclusively for Insurrection and Nemesis. In fact, past this movie there would be no more physical models of the Enterprise used for filming at all. This leads us to the USS Enterprise NX-01 from Star Trek Enterprise. There was some discussion about whether this ship should be made to look similar to the original Enterprise, but ultimately, the decision was made to pull it away from that design a little bit more. Such as not having a secondary hull, having thicker pylons, and having red Bussard collectors instead of orange. The idea behind this starship was to create a ship that was a predecessor to the original Enterprise. The deflector dish, saucer section, and 2 warp nacelles all contributed to this. If the series wasn't cancelled after the 4th season, there were plans for the ship to undergo a massive refit, which would have added a secondary hull, giving the ship a much closer resemblance to the original Enterprise. Also during the run of Star Trek Enterprise, we get a sneak peek into the distant future, specifically the Enterprise J. There it is. That's all we see in this episode, as well as this window. Unfortunately, an actual model couldn't be created for this ship. We do have some slightly less official models and designs to go off of though, that show what the ship would have looked like. And that's all we got for several years, until 2009 when J.J. Abrams made his reboot movie. His vision of the Enterprise was to make it have a hot rod look, or doing a 2009 version of the 60s. The result is a ship that looks really good, but doesn't really resemble the original Enterprise in anything but the basic structure. Whether that's good or bad is up to individual taste. However, the creation of this Enterprise does have a couple stories worth telling. The first teaser trailer for the movie showed the construction of the Enterprise, and the marketing team learned an important lesson on how insane Star Trek fans can be when the fans measured the workers against the Enterprise to determine that this Enterprise would be even larger than the Enterprise D. The size of the Enterprise was something that was decided later on in production, when J.J. Abrams wanted more of a big screen presence from the ship. There are a few scenes in the movie where the Enterprise seems to be much smaller than it's supposed to be. However, these size issues were fixed by the next movie. The Bussard collectors were also originally a more accurate orange color, but when rendering some shots for the movie, a few frames had inverted colors, turning the Bussard collectors blue, and it was decided that it just looked better for this version of the Enterprise. However you may feel about this Enterprise, it was still kind of sad to see it go at the very beginning of Star Trek Beyond. It's not very common for a movie to kill the main character off in the first act like that. However, it does allow for the emergence of the next USS Enterprise A. I have to admit that I was very disappointed when I first saw this. I really liked the original refit Enterprise design, and I was looking forward to seeing it reimagined. However, funnily enough, I actually like this design better when compared to the original Enterprise. It's much more similar than the original Kelvin timeline Enterprise was. However, my comments on this Enterprise are as short as the appearance of this Enterprise. There's not really all that much to say. And this leads us to 2018. Specifically, Season 1 of Star Trek Discovery, where the Enterprise is name-dropped real quick, and then we move on.
6.5 seconds is not an arbitrary number. Your new time will earn you a physical endurance commendation. Today, your goal is 6.5 seconds. Then, getting a transfer on a Constitution class like the Enterprise. After that, first officer trial.
Except, at the very end of the season, the Discovery gets a distress call, and it becomes apparent very quickly who's calling.
Incoming transmission.
From whom?
I'm having trouble identifying it, but it's a priority 1 distress call.
Identify the source, please.
I'm getting a Federation ID code. It's choppy. Trying to clean it up, sir.
Helm, slow us down.
Dropping a set of warp now, sir.
This is Captain Saru of the Federation Starship Discovery. Please identify yourselves.
Hails from Captain Pike, sir.
It's the USS Enterprise.
Look at this masterpiece. This is a beautiful ship. I won't even try to be objective about it. I am in love with this. It's a fantastic recreation of the original Enterprise, but with some changes to bring it up to where Star Trek is at now. There are some changes made to it, such as these windows and the glowing nacelles, but for the most part, this is an incredibly faithful version of the original Enterprise. Part of the design of this Enterprise was to make it seem a bit more dated than the original series, so it can have some elements replaced to become even more accurate. However, this isn't even the end of the list. In 2011, the Star Trek MMO game Star Trek Online held a competition to design the next Enterprise after the movie Nemesis. Adam Eiley won the competition, so the unofficial USS Enterprise F was unveiled. Star Trek Online isn't exactly canon in the Star Trek universe, so the most we ever really got was an unofficial design. However, in Picard Season 3, we see the official Enterprise F.
Clear for departure. Happy Frontier Day.
It's that same design. The Star Trek Online design is officially canon. Unfortunately, the only time we see this Enterprise is on its final flight. In the same season, however, we see the USS Titan A refit of the original Titan. It's designed to be a further advancement of the original Enterprise, and thus has a lot of design elements carried over straight from the first set of movies. These similarities become even more obvious when you fill in the cutout sections of the hull. The design was made to be reminiscent of the original series while still moving forward with the design. And thus, it's very fitting that this becomes the new Enterprise G, bringing the design of the Enterprise back to where it started. And as of the writing of this video, that's all we have. Every version of the USS Enterprise. Well, there is this picture of an Enterprise, but that's all we really have for it, so it's not really worth mentioning. In this video, at least. The Enterprise is one of my favorite ships of all time, so learning these stories behind the design and creation of it is really fun. Coming at some point in the future is Part 2, where I'll talk more about the in-universe evolution of the Enterprise. Hope to see you there!